Happy Sabbath, church. Happy Sabbath. It's good to be with you all. And is it just me? Does it feel like winter's already here? Hope you've had a wonderful week. I know my week's been good. It's been busy, but it's been good. As you can see, work's being done outside on the balcony. The council's doing some upgrades there. But I hope you guys are keeping safe. I hope the flu hasn't come to your home yet. I know it's starting to. As Non-Pillow mentioned last week, we had our think tank, just an opportunity for those of you who are visiting to just sit down and ask, well, what can we do with the place and the people God has surrounded us with? And so we want to be just sort of getting in focus with, well, what's God doing here? What has He called us to? And it's part of the reason why I wanted to preach through the sermon series of Luke, to just see what Jesus is all about. And as we journey through Luke's story of Jesus together, we can actually start to see what makes Jesus' heartbeat. And so we're going to continue on in our series. Today we're going to be focusing in Luke chapter 9. And it was really cool. We had Pastor Simmer, a good friend of mine, sharing the word last week. Incidentally, from Luke, I didn't ask him to, but it was a really cool thing, and I think God wants us to be here in this book this year. Well, we're in chapter 9, like I mentioned, and guys, we are now doing something which absolutely breaks my heart. I said to Emma, do you reckon Pakenham would be okay with me if we preached through Luke for like 2 years, 3 years, and cover every single story? She's like, I don't know if they're going to be that gracious, Ryan. But see, this is where we have to start jumping over stories, missing little things. So we're skipping over chapter 7, we're skipping over chapter 8, and a lot of this provides context for Jesus' Galilean ministry. Galilee is in the north, and this is where a lot of important things are happening. Miracles are happening. We see a centurion servant being healed. Jesus raises a widow's son. John the baptizer has questions. Is Jesus really the Messiah? Mary Magdalene is forgiven at Simon's party. All right. We see Jesus mention the female disciples, and what an important topic that is. Okay. He talks about parables and their purposes. He calms a storm, casts a demon out. I mean, so much is happening. He goes to the Gentile lands. So many important things are happening that I have to skip over, and it breaks my heart. Today we're focusing on chapter 9, and again, chapter 9, guys, so much beautiful content in here. In chapter 9, we have a transition taking place in the story. We've been spending time in Galilee for the first third of Luke's gospel, Luke's story about Jesus. And chapter 9, as far as the book being a literary, work, chapter 9, we're transitioning. And next week, we're going to see that Jesus is going to start to head towards Jerusalem. Okay? So things are going to be sort of resolved here before we move on to the next part of the story. And what does Luke want to resolve? Well, he wants to resolve once and for all, who is Jesus? Who is he? And so this question of who Jesus is, theologians use one word to describe this question: Christology. Any heard of that word? Christology? Christology is the study of Jesus, who he is, what his mission is all about. But Luke doesn't just cover Christology in chapter 9. He also looks at what it means to be a disciple. The disciples for the very first time we've seen Jesus call them, but now we're going to see them emerge, and we're going to see their character and their story arc develop, right? You love a good book or a good novel, a good movie where you see characters develop. Well, we're going to be introduced to some key characters, key disciples, whose stories will be developed. But more than anything else, in chapter 9, we see the question of who is Jesus really answered. Now, as readers, Luke's showing us who Jesus is, but he wants us to step into the mind of the audience of the day. And he wants us to see that they still don't really know who he is. You see, they've got one expectation, but their expectations are going to be subverted. It's going to be changed. I read this week, and I don't know if this reference will go over your head, but you guys all remember Michael Jordan, yeah? All know Michael Jordan. There was a great documentary on him. Everybody watched it during COVID, yeah? No? It was not too bad. It wasn't too bad. The Last Dance. Check it out. Now, they didn't just look at Michael Jordan, but they looked at the team that he was on. And one of the literally most colorful characters on Michael Jordan's team was a guy by the name of Dennis Rodman. Yeah, some of you guys are nodding. All right, Hendricks is like, yeah, I know Dennis Rodman. Dennis Rodman was a good defender. One day his hair would be green, the next day would be purple. Like Dennis Rodman was this guy. He was known as the party boy on the team, not the kind of guy you'd want to be a role model in your youth group, right? But I was reading about Dennis Rodman, and this week it came out that this guy, party guy, probably did drugs, not the best role model, really good basket player, really good defender. Whenever he would go to Boston, the city of Boston on the east coast of America, I think it must have been his hometown, this guy would, do you remember the shop Toys R Us? Anybody? Yeah? Toys R Us? Yeah? I'm showing my age. So many of you kids are like, what is Toys R Us? It was like, imagine Big W, but it's just filled with toys. That was Toys R Us. Toys R Us, he would go to Toys R Us's shops in Boston whenever Chicago would be playing the Boston Celtics. And he would open up the entire shop and he would just let underprivileged children come in and they would buy whatever they want. He did this every time he went to Boston. And nobody knew about this. And he made sure that the reporters would never find out because he didn't want people to go, oh, Dennis Rodman is like the party boy and he just wants to get a good reputation. He's like, no, I don't care what they think about me. I really want to do this for some underprivileged kids. Now me, as a 36-year-old who was obsessed with Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls, anybody was obsessed with them back in the day? Yeah, okay, we see a few folks. Yeah, I'm reading this and I'm like, man, this guy was just not what I expected. Can you sort of see that? I mean, there was this one side, definitely not a great guy, but on the other side, he had this real philanthropic heart. He really cared for the kids in his hometown, in his community. And I share this, I was trying to think, what's a good example I could share? There's many examples, but all this to say, people have an expectation of Jesus, and Jesus is going to completely radicalize what they thought Jesus should and was meant to be. That's what you see in chapter 9. And so I want to look this week at the Christology of Jesus. Who is he? Okay? And all the while, I want you to ask yourself, who is he to me? What are the things that I have believed my whole life? I've never questioned them. I've never really challenged those beliefs. Luke is inviting you. And I'm not trying to turn the church upside down, but I really believe after spending hours in this chapter, I really think Luke is saying, Jesus is not the person you think you know. There's a lot more to this guy. So let's demonstrate this. Now, I'm actually going to revisit chapter 9 next week. You'll be like, what? There was too much to cover. And so next week we're going to look at discipleship because it's such an important theme in Luke. Today we're looking at the person of Jesus, but we're not going to go through story by story. So I'm going to give you the lay of the land. You all right with me? You can see in your Bible the subheadings, but here are some of the things that happen in Luke chapter 9. We see Jesus for the first time send out the 12 disciples. They've kind of been in apprenticeship mode until now, sitting on the sidelines. And he's like, okay, here's your first assignment, go out. And we're going to look at that a little bit. We see that King Herod is finding out about Jesus. Not King Herod at Jesus' birth, it's his son. So his son now is kind of like, who is this guy? We're going to look about him. Jesus will feed 5,000 in chapter 9. Peter will confess that who Jesus is, which is very important. Jesus will foretell his death, which is also very important, and it's a motivating portion of the story for what takes place. We will see the transfiguration where Jesus is transformed. And then the chapter ends with the disciples who are failing to heal a boy who's filled with demons. Okay? And there's an argument over who is the best disciple. So a lot is happening in chapter 9. But the question we want to answer is, who really is Jesus? And we've already started to explore. Jesus is a better Moses, right? He's bringing in a new Exodus. We've seen that Jesus is a great prophetic figure. We've seen that Jesus is a king. But it seems a lot of people are still asking these questions. Who is he? And we see this question framed in Luke chapter 3. We're going to be in 9, but he begins this question in Luke 3, right at Jesus' baptism. When Jesus is baptized, in Luke 3 verse 22, the tail end, it says, "A voice from heaven was heard saying, 'You are my beloved Son. With you I am well pleased.'" Okay, so there's a voice. We're at Pakenham Lake. Jesus is baptized and everybody hears this voice. "This is my Son in whom I am well pleased." That's freaky. What just happened? Okay? So people have heard, is this God's Son? But in the next verse 23, it says, Jesus, when he began his ministry, was about 30 years of age, being the son of Joseph. On literally 2 verses apart, God's son, Joseph's son. Well, what is it? Who is this guy? Luke demonstrates this because up until now, so many people have been asking. I've been asking you guys to read Luke. Anybody reading Luke? Good. Now, if you've been reading Luke, you will notice a lot of people come up and question, like, who is this guy? Here is everything. I wanted to share with this, just so you know I'm not making this up. First thing people ask, is this Joseph's son in Luke? All right? On another occasion, Jesus is teaching up in Capernaum, and people say, who is this man? And what is his teaching? It's so powerful. Who is this guy who has authority over demons? Again, who is he? Pharisees are like, man, this guy is doing things that we consider blasphemy. Who is this man? Again, is he a great prophet? Luke's asking this question on behalf of his audience. John the Baptizer. Can you, my disciples, my students, can you go to Jesus? I'm a bit concerned he isn't the guy I thought he was meant to be. Can you interview him? Can you ask him, is he the guy I was meant to be expecting? Okay, now that you could completely be manipulated in that situation. There's a lot of trust there, right? But John doesn't know, okay, not 100% sure. Pharisees again. We think he can't be a prophet because he's let an unclean woman, Mary, touch him. If he knew what kind of a woman she was, he wouldn't have let her touch him. He clearly can't be a prophet, or is he? Like, that's kind of the setting, all right? Then the crowds know that only God forgives sin. And on one occasion, Jesus heals a person, forgives him. And they're like, oh. It's like if I just kind of said, we're not a Catholic church, Hendricks, I absolve you of your sins. And everyone's like, that's not this church, Pastor Ryan. Like, that's what's happening in the crowd. They're like, who is this guy who thinks he can forgive sins? Only God can forgive sins. But finally, we see so far the disciples on the sea. They're in the boat. There's a storm. We know the story. It's hectic. It's crazy. All right? And Jesus just says, peace, shalom, be still. And they're just like, Peter, yes, John, did you just see that? He just spoke to the storm. Like, he's a great teacher and all, but like, I didn't know he could do that. And they're literally like, who is this guy? Can you see Luke is very interested in the question of who is Jesus? And he wants you to see from the person who is furthest away from Jesus to the people who are right up close. They live with him, sleep with him, eat with him, breathe the same air. Everyone doesn't know who he is. Who is Jesus to you? I mean, do you really know? Who is Jesus? Who is he in your life? What purpose does he perform? What is your relationship? Luke is very interested in Christology. Now, here's the thing. Like I said, chapter 9 is about Christology. Who is Jesus? But it's also about discipleship. And I want to read you something I found preparing for this week. You see, these two ideas cannot be separated. And that's why I have to do part 2. You cannot be a faithful disciple. This is a quote. You can't be a faithful disciple without knowing the work and purpose of Jesus. Does that make sense? You can't sit at the feet of Jesus and learn from him if you don't really know who he is. But catch this. You can't understand the work of Jesus without entering into the work of being a disciple. That's what chapter 9 tells us, and that's why I need to revisit it next week and look at this from the lens of being a disciple. We need to do both. If you want to understand Jesus, you need to walk his walk, and when he says, come follow me, you need to say, yeah, I'm going to follow. And friends, part of my goal, part of my dream for our church is that this would be a church of disciples. People who don't just believe in Jesus, but we are walking, because what I'm learning through my own experience and as I read, I'm seeing so many people discover who Jesus is, particularly in the following after. Particularly when he says, can you go out into that community over there and start sharing me? Boy, are you going to discover who I am. Boy, are you going to see how hard it is. And chapter 9 is so full of how hard it is to follow Jesus. Who is he to you? Are you walking the walk of discipleship? Are you encountering who he is, not just mentally, but in a day-to-day kind of a way? Who is Jesus? We all need to answer our questions of who he is. Luke wants to tease out the question of who Jesus is in the very opening verse. Let's have a look. Chapter 9 and verse 1. I mean, Luke's going to show Jesus is doing something really crazy and far-fetched. I mean, if I was Jesus, I don't know if I'd be doing this. Put it this way. In verse 1 it says, and he, Jesus, called the 12 disciples together, and he gave them power. Catch this. Jesus is giving power and authority over all demons and to cure disease. Well, early in Luke, Jesus is described as having been given all power and authority. And now he's giving it away. I'm telling you guys, this pastor suffers from pride. Be honest. If God gave me all power and authority, I don't know if I'd want to share it with you. I'm being honest here. I want people to go, man, we couldn't live without Pastor Ryan. I know, guys. I mean, I would much prefer that relationship. And here is Jesus going, Danny, I trust you. I want to share what I have with you. I'm like, Danny can be a teacher. I'm a pastor here. Do you know what I mean? I'm opening my heart to you. But Jesus, this is the thing. My questions are being provoked when I read this. Who is this guy? Right? I mean, you're supposed to be the savior of the world, and you are sharing the thing that is elevating your platform. You are sharing the thing that is drawing people to you. Do you know, Jesus, that Peter might have his own independent ministry? Are you okay with that? Maybe Peter's going to get a big head and he's going to run and do his own thing. Are you cool with that? Do you know? Jesus is sharing what he has. Okay? And verse 6, it says, we're going to look at the in-between verses next week. But verse 6 says, and they departed and they went to the villages. They were preaching the gospel and healing everywhere. They're doing it. And it seems like they're doing a pretty good job. I don't feel comfortable with sharing my platform. That's the human in me. But Jesus is so different, right? Okay? Who is this guy who is sharing his skills? We're going to answer that question next week. But we see in this chapter 9 that he's also feeding thousands. feeding thousands. And again, you're meant to ask, who is this guy? And Luke wants you to see, particularly in chapter 9, that this guy is very much like the prophet Moses. I mean, I want you to follow. Think about the sequence of events in Luke 9 and think about Moses. In the life of Moses, Moses would have this issue where he needs to feed a multitude, right? And through Moses and his leadership, God will provide manna. It's not like it came through manna, but this is something connected with the person of Moses, right? Moses will also climb a mountain and encounter God in a very special way, all right? And only to go up just to be discouraged by what he sees when he gets to the top. Now watch this. Jesus will feed thousands, okay? And he is going to climb up the mountain and encounter God in a special way, only to come back down the mountain and be discouraged by the lack of faith in his disciples. They're arguing and they're bickering of who is the greatest. Luke wants you to see Jesus is like Moses, but to say that he is Moses is not quite right. Let's see this in verse 7 of chapter 9. Now Herod the Tetrarch heard about all that was happening. The disciples are clearly doing a good job. Jesus is doing a good job. Everything that's come so far in the narrative of the healings, the miracles, the centurion's daughter, Jairus' daughter, Herod's hearing about it. I mean, this does not happen in a vacuum, right? If miracles were happening as a result of Lakeside Church, do you think the community would know about it? I mean, at the scale that it's happening in Jesus' life, they would know about it. All right? He hears about it and he's perplexed because it was said by some that John had been raised from the dead, by some that Elijah had appeared, and by others that one of the prophets of old had risen. Verse 9, Herod said, I beheaded John, but who is this about whom I hear such things? And he, Herod, sought to see him. Is he John? This is what the crowds are saying. Is he John the Baptizer? Is he Elijah? Is he a great prophet come back from the dead? And Herod comes to the right answer. And the answer is no, he isn't any of these things. But Herod raises a very good question in himself. But who reveals Jesus to you? I mean, Herod doesn't know who he is. Your political leaders don't know. The crowds have a perception, which is kind of right, but it's not altogether true. Who reveals Jesus to you? I mean, this pastor has a sense of who Jesus is, but who reveals Jesus to you? This is the question. Now, later in the story, Jesus, when you read Desire of Ages, you get the sense that he is starting to process that the time for him to die is coming. And this is the context, and I think it actually makes sense, because when Jesus thinks of King Herod, man, wasn't this the guy who just murdered my cousin, right? And my cousin didn't do, he wasn't the worst guy. I mean, I'm doing a lot more than my cousin. And I mean, Jesus, imagine processing that. And so verse 18, our Ellen White suggests, is being prompted by this question of death. And it actually adds an interesting lens when you read verse 18. Now it happened, Jesus has done the miracle, he's fed thousands. Now it happened that as he was praying alone, the disciples were with him. And he asked them, who do the crowds say that I am? This is going to be a learning question. Jesus knows, but he needs the disciples to start processing. And they answered, catch this, John the Baptist, but others say Elijah, and others that you are one of the prophets of old who is risen. Well, isn't that what Herod had heard? Right? Why is Luke repeating this? He wants you to know that the crowds can be a source of information, and it's not altogether right. Herod has the information, but it's not altogether right. Okay. Then he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered, "The Christ of God." Peter knows. Yeah? Peter knows. Who revealed Jesus to you? Friends, I'm going to say this, and I have to be careful what I say now. I mean, we can come to Sabbath school and talk about Jesus, intellectually learn about him, but as a community, we cannot make Ryan ultimately know who Jesus is. Yeah? We can be a part of that journey. We can do Bible studies. We can teach. But Luke's saying the crowd alone can't, like a good community can't alone do this. A leader alone cannot be the source of your learning, like Herod. When you read Mark's version of this, Mark adds a little extra thing that Luke takes out. But Jesus says, "Man, Peter, awesome, because this was revealed to you." Guys, it's ultimately God who reveals who Jesus is in your life. The crowd can help you learn, the leader can teach and preach about Jesus every week of the year, but ultimately there's a Holy Spirit thing that's happening where the penny drops and we come to the realization of who Jesus is. Churches are important, pastors are important, but man, God ultimately needs to break through. And he broke through with Peter. Has Jesus broken through with who he is in your life? The word that we have when Peter says Jesus is the Christ, it's literally the Hebrew word Messiah. It's the Greek translation. And when Peter says Jesus is the Messiah, it's saying, I believe that you are the king we have been waiting for. Now, Peter, we will realize, actually still has a lot more learning, but he's on the right path. That's what matters most. And we can see that there's a lot of unlearning because Luke's, the more I read this book, the more I'm like, man, God, how did you inspire these guys? There are so many cool little literary devices just tucked away. For instance, this is the thing how I know that the disciples don't really, they know that Jesus is the Messiah. Good. It's a good starting ground. But man, is there a lot of unlearning. Because they keep calling Jesus epistata. All right? Epistata. Or in other words, your Bibles might say master, but a better translation of epistata is boss. Hey, boss. Anybody call their boss boss? You know, hey, boss. How you doing, boss? Good to see you, boss. When I go to the conference office and I see Graham Christian, hey, boss. That's who he is to me. Okay? But they keep calling Jesus boss. Now you're like, all right, that's cool, boss. Here's the thing. In every situation where the disciples call Jesus boss, there's a story which is attached to it where they were completely wrong about how he was the boss. Let me show you. Hey, boss, we've been fishing all night. We know how to catch fish. All right, but if you want us to go throw some nets out on the other side of the boat, we'll do it. Hey, boss. Hey, boss, don't you care if we drown in this lake? Hey, boss, do they get who he is? No. Hey, boss, you've asked us to tell you who's touched you and who touched you to get healed. There is a sea of people we are in right now. How do you expect us to know? Hey, boss. Hey, boss. We are on this mountain where we've just seen Moses and Elijah. Let's build 3 tents so you guys can permanently live on them. We can have a cool religious holiday. They didn't get it. Hey, boss. Literally in chapter 9. We struggled to cast out the demons. What's going on? Luke wants you to see, they recognize he's the Messiah, but they still have so much unlearning to do. Yeah? And this is what, it pains me to say this because I can only conclude that Luke is saying for anybody who follows Jesus, there is a lot of unlearning that needs to take place. And why I say that pains me is because I see Vince. Vince is an awesome guy, and he's been a man of faith for many years. Is Luke saying that Vince has still unlearning to do? Maybe he is. Is he saying Ryan, who's grown up in the church for 36 years, I've never not been to church. Sean, Charles, we've grown up in church together. Is he saying there's things that Sean and I don't have to unlearn? I think he's saying there are things we need to unlearn. And I actually can't tell you what those things are. Those are things between you and Jesus. But is he still the boss to you? Does he need to undo some of your thinking about who he is? Does Christ need to do a Christological, reconfiguration in your experience? Well, that's what the story of Luke's all about. Don't we see the disciples go on that journey? They're living and breathing life with him. So I think it's not too bold of a thing to say that we need to relearn Jesus. Sit at his feet. Catch this in chapter 8:25, when they're on the lake. Boss, he said to them, where is your faith? And they were afraid. And they marveled, saying to one another, who is this? There's our question, that he commands even the winds and the water. They don't know who he is. We need to unlearn. Now, like I said, I think the framework for Jesus asking, who does everybody say I am? I think it's framed with Jesus knowing that he's about to die. And we're going to look, like I said, at the things that disciples will go through next week. But Jesus basically, suffice to say, has had a very heavy conversation. Imagine if I preach to you, which I'm going to do next week, but hopefully we'll have some gospel. Imagine if I come and just preach to you, being a disciple sucks, it's not nice, it's going to be painful, it hurts, I'm going to be beaten to a pulp, I'm going to die. This is what's going to be Pakenham Church's history. Hooray for Pakenham. Wouldn't that be a fun rallying the troops kind of a speech? I could see all of you guys that's just awkward. And it is. And so I think this sets the scene for our transfiguration, which was read so beautifully. I want to read it very quickly. 9, verse 28. We pick up there. Now, about 8 days after all of these things, they've been soaking and processing Jesus' heavy words. Jesus takes Peter and John and James up, and they went up on the mountain to pray. These are the same three that will come to the Garden of Gethsemane. I don't know what it is about these guys, but they're close to Jesus. And I think in a moment of heaviness, he's hoping these guys can be a shoulder to lean on. And there we see that he was praying, and the appearance of his face was altered, and his clothing became dazzling white. Again, when you read Desire of Ages on this, she says that Jesus is weeping just at the thought of what needs to happen. It's like a Garden of Gethsemane experience, which we will definitely cover. It's a story that shaped my life. But we have a mini Garden of Gethsemane here where Jesus is weeping, he's crying, he knows what his disciples are going to go through, he knows what he's going to go through, and he's going, God, can you help somehow? Can you keep my disciples' trust in me? They still don't know who I am. They say I'm the Messiah, but they still call me boss. And so God is going to intervene in a powerful way. And his appearance changed, literally transfigures. And that's where we get our word transfiguration from. It's transformed. Okay? His clothing became dazzling white. Verse 30. And behold, 2 men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his departure. They start to talk to him about the things that need to take place. Does Moses talk about the new exodus that Jesus is going to be doing? Is he there to encourage? Is Elijah there to encourage? Man, I had it tough trying to teach people that Baal is not God. You are going to have a hard time doing the same, but hang in there. God's got you. These guys, these 2 men have walked some of the hardest walks of any spiritual leader, and they're sent at a crucial moment to encourage. But don't they answer the question of who is Jesus? Because you can't be Moses and have Moses talking to you. You can't be Elijah, a great prophet, and have Elijah talking to you. And this is settling the question in the disciples' minds as much as anybody else's. We've talked a lot about Moses, not too much about Elijah, but we are supposed to settle. He's not just a better Moses. He's going to actually be so much more, and we'll see why. Okay? Verse 31, they appeared in glory and spoke of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. And verse 32, now Peter and those who were with him were heavy with sleep, but when they became fully awake, they saw his glory. They see divinity flashing through the person of Jesus. Just close your eyes and imagine. I don't even know what you're going to imagine, but your brain's going to bring up something, and it's powerful. Jesus is not just a human. They see, no, this guy is God. Like, we've been calling him boss, but he's so much more than that, right? Okay, and so we pick it up again, all right? As they were praying, they saw him, verse 33, and as the men were parting from him, Peter said to Jesus, Master, is it good that we are here? Let us make 3 tents. We've talked about this. One for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah, not knowing what he said. He doesn't know what he's on about, basically, Luke is saying. Verse 34, as he was saying these things, and catch this, we know he's not Moses, we know he's not Elijah. Here we have who he is. As he was saying these things, a cloud came over and overshadowed them, and they were afraid because the presence of God's drawing near, guys. And as they entered the cloud, and verse 35, and a voice came out of the cloud, very reminiscent of the baptism. This is my son, my chosen one. Listen to him. This is my son, my chosen one. Listen to him. So much is being said in so little. Like, the Bible nerd in me gets so excited. And I can see you guys are like, what's happening? Like, it's so much is happening, guys. This is my son, my chosen son. God is saying Jesus is the Son of God. And in that time in history, that is to say Jesus is God. Boom. Claim of divinity. This, he is my son, is a messianic statement. This is what God said about King David. Jesus is another better king, better David. Okay? All right? He is God's chosen one. He is the suffering servant, my servant. This is language of the prophets. This is language of Isaiah. And we could talk about this for so long. But God wanted Peter, James, and John to really know who Jesus was. Do you know who Jesus is? That is the question. Do you know that he's not just a good teacher? He's not just a good moral man, but he is the hope of the world from eternity past. Do you know that? Have you experienced that? Has he revealed himself to you? I want to read this quote from a theologian I was reading this week, Joel B. Green. If you want to see where I learned a lot of stuff from, I got a giant book in the pram. I've been reading it. I love it. But this is Joel B. Green. From this perspective, the unimpeachable perspective of God is provided. Jesus is not simply a prophet or even a prophet like Moses. Rather, he is the Messiah, the Son of God. As such, he stands in the prophetic tradition, identifying above all with Moses and Elijah, and inaugurating the hoped-for redemption foretold and described in the language of the new Exodus, by the prophets, especially Isaiah. Beautiful statement. It just says this is who he is. And God's perspective closes this question. I mean, everybody else down the mountain still doesn't know, but hey, I've got 3 men now and they know. And that will make all the difference. When just 3 men or women know in this church, without a shadow of a doubt, it will make all the difference. Now, you might be thinking, and this is very important, we're closing now. I went long. This is why I had to cut this into 2. I was meant to do 2 topics today. You can imagine that? You might be asking, I have people in my life that I want to know who Jesus is. Yeah? Do you want people to know who Jesus is like Peter, James, and John do? At least get to the starting point where they can say, no, this guy really is the Messiah. Two things emerge in chapter 9. Every time somebody makes a discovery, Jesus has just been praying. Jesus has just been praying. Luke 9:18. Now it happened that as he was praying alone, the disciples were with him, and he asked them, who do the crowd say I am? Moments of discovery happen when we are praying to know who Jesus is and for others to know. 8 days later on the mountain, Jesus is praying up on a mountain in verse 28. Friends, don't underestimate the value of praying for the people you love. Can I say that? I mean, isn't this so obvious? Sean, we were talking about the simple, obvious things that we're just like, it's just too easy. Isn't this the easiest thing? To sincerely pray that people would know who Jesus is. And I know when I look at everyone here, you have somebody so close to your heart that you just so badly want them to know who Jesus is, right? I could see it in your face. And I could feel the emotion because I have people like that in my life. And I want them so badly to know. And the story of Luke is saying, get on your knees. Pray about it. I'm going to finish with this little story. It's a true story. I want to read it. We're going to invite the song team up. This is a story by a theologian. He says, my grandfather, my father, and his brothers were all tough men who understandably didn't appreciate people who got up in their faces about faith. When my father, Howard, was diagnosed with a rapid and deadly cancer, I was so concerned that I took every opportunity to talk to him about Jesus' love. Inevitably, he would end the discussion with a polite but firm, I know what I need to know. I promised not to raise the issue again, and I gave him a set of cards that shared the forgiveness God offers, which he could read when he wanted. I entrusted Dad to God, and I prayed. I also asked a friend also to keep Dad in his prayers and alive long enough to know Jesus. One afternoon, the call came telling me that Dad was gone. When my brother met me at the airport, he said, Dad told me to tell you he asked Jesus to forgive his sins. I love this story. It's so simple. He asked Jesus to forgive his sins. When? The morning he passed, Mark replied. God had shown him mercy, and he had shown us mercy as well. Friends, don't give up. You might think it's been a waste of time, the conversations and the prayers. Keep at it, please. Because the crowds cannot convict your heart that Jesus is Jesus. This pastor cannot convict your mother, your father, your brother, your cousin, your sister, your wife. I can share the facts, but man, it's Jesus who needs to break through. I want to invite our worship team. We're going to sing our final song. The wonder of it all, right? Isn't it a wonder that God can break through hearts? Let's sing prayerfully, passionately, believing that God can break through. Believe in the wonder of it all.